All right, everyone. I just want to welcome you here. My name is Eric Melton. I am the Department Chair of Student Services. Also work with all these wonderful people in the Saxon shirts out here who are here just to help support and provide some resources. We're really fortunate today to have Jackie Rhew here with us. Jackie's been working in this field of both therapy and parent education and staff education for a long time now, has lots of experience, and so we're just really fortunate to have her here with us. So please give a welcome round of applause to Jackie.
So how are you guys doing tonight? Good? Good. So, as he said, I'm Jackie Rhew, and I've been doing this for about 25 years. I've worked in schools. Actually, when I first started out my career, I was in school engagement in Gary, Indiana, and I worked in the truancy area in a high school. And one of the things we did actually is we drove around town, and kids that weren't in school, we put them in our van and we drove them to school. We didn't ask them how they felt. We didn't ask them about their feelings. We said, "You're not in school. You need to be in school." Shortly after that, I lived in Kuwait for almost 5 years, and I started a counseling program over there to help kids after the Gulf War engage in school. And one of the things we did is we looked at helping, and in particular I was working with female students, and we were looking at helping them engage. And I've been back here working in schools and hospitals for the last 20 years. As we're going to talk about, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself so you know who is talking to you, and then we'll get started. I have 2 kids myself, and they are 22 and 23. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you tonight is because I've made pretty much every mistake in the book. So don't think that we're here tonight and you guys are supposed to really do everything right and that parenting is just this amazing thing that your kids turned out wonderful and pretty and polite and perfect, because it's not true. So parenting is challenging, but the good news is we don't see the full end product until they're about 26, 27. So if your kids are struggling right now or they're not in the best place, that doesn't mean, and it's not necessarily a predictor of where they're going to be in 5 years. Every child develops differently, and we're going to talk about that tonight. So these are my 2. My oldest is actually a school social worker now in Chicago Public Schools. Do you think that causes me a little bit of anxiety? Yeah. Youngest just moved to DC, and she's a computer science programmer. I have 2 kids, completely different, a year apart. That's me. I was finally in a wedding this summer, maid of honor, that we waited about 2 years to have. Now you can guess when I start to get lonely because my kids are gone. Miss Nala gets adopted in the beginning of COVID. My favorite thing to do that keeps me sane is my self-care is running. So it's something that gets me out of the house. It keeps me centered, and I like to do a lot of giving back. Cindy, you probably recognize June there on the bottom. Something that's important to me. So that's a little bit about me. I love the work I do. I speak to about 3 to 4 schools, sometimes a week. I do a ton of parent universities. I speak to parents all over the state and the Midwest. So a lot of what I'm going to share is ideas I've gotten from other parents. So I will learn from you guys as well tonight, and we can have some dialogue. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to make comments. You know, some of what I'm going to say may be really helpful for you, and there may be things I say that you're like, it doesn't fit for me and my parenting style, and that's okay. There's not a one way to do things. So those of you that are very like black and white and have to have it like written down that this is what you do, I am not going to give you tonight, this is what you do to go home and have everything magically better with your child. I want you to think about the ideas and think about what resonates for you. This is hard to see here, but this is what's going to be important. How are you feeling tonight? How are you feeling tonight? It's hard to see, and I'm not sure why it's coming up, but we have a tendency today, and I've noticed this. I have a clinic. I own 2 locations. We have about 22 therapists. I have a lot of parents calling, and they say, I need my kid treated right away. I need my kid seen for anxiety. I'm here to tell you not everything is anxiety. We have all kinds of feelings. There's not good or bad feelings. There's feelings. And so it's important for us to be aware of how we're feeling, but it's also important for us to allow our kids to feel. And as parents, and I know this was hard for me, we have a tendency to want our kids to feel what? Right? So when they're not happy, what happens? Our radar goes up, and we want to make them feel better. We want to make them feel less anxious. We want to make them feel happy. We want them to be content. And when they're not happy, our anxiety can raise, and then we automatically want to do something to kind of fix it. And that's sending a message to them that it's not okay to be anything other than happy. We want our kids to actually learn how to be stressed in a healthy way, how to be sad, how to deal with loss, how to deal with things. And part of what we have to do is be mindful of our reactions. We have to know how to have that game face. Because when our kids look sad, and every time our kids look sad, we make that face, we're sending them a message that that's not okay. When we right away say things like, what's wrong? What happened? Did something happen? I have sometimes parents will come to me and they'll bring their kids to me for therapy, and they'll get really stressed when their kids leave a session and are mad or not happy. Jackie, they weren't happy when they left your office. Okay, I did a good job. I want you to say to the child, how could you go back and communicate to Jackie? How would you go talk to Jackie about that? Does that make sense? This is probably this was one of the hardest things for me as a parent, because when my child was struggling, it raised my anxiety and I had a hard time with it. So I had to practice staying calm. I had to practice managing my own anxiety. I always use that analogy of the flight attendant. If we're all on an airplane and there's a lot of turbulence, who are you going to look to assess the situation? Right. And what if I'm like, or, are you okay? Like, I'm going to give you a hug. You're going to be okay. You got this. You can do this. You're going to be like, oh my God, we're really dying if she's up there doing that. Our kids look to us and they need us to be calm, and that's probably the hardest thing. So part of it is we have to figure out as parents, what triggers emotional reactions in us? What triggers us to be stressed? What triggers us to worry? What triggers us to be frustrated? What triggers us to be emotional? And so I ask this, allowing our kids to know it's okay to have feelings. And sometimes, just asking our kids, how are you, can be helpful. When you see them, and I know sometimes we get the grades to our phone. For how many of you does that spike anxiety? It does. When you see your child, don't necessarily just ask the first thing out of your mouth about grades or school. Maybe start with, how are you? And be ready just to listen. And if you know you're feeling anxious, kind of take a minute to calm. I work a lot with parents that have kids that are struggling going to school and have school anxiety. And one of the first things I say to those parents is make sure that you're calm. I would rather your kid not go to school than you yelling and screaming and pulling them out of bed and crying and begging them and bartering with them. We have to first stay calm and then figure out what our purpose is and what we're trying to do. Having a hard time with this today. What do you think teenagers need to feel supported? How do we show our teens that we're supporting them? What are ways you guys show your teenagers you're supporting them? Listen. And that's not always easy to do. That's not always easy to do. Best advice I ever got is listen. And I had to put that in practice when my 22-year-old daughter, 21 at the time, told me she was going to finish college. I called Ginger. I was like crying. She told me she was going to finish college and become a bartender on a cruise ship. I was like, hell no. But I remember what I was told. They're going to say a million crazy things to you. If you don't react and say something like, that sounds interesting, go research it and come back and we'll talk about it, is the best thing you can do sometimes, because guess what? They don't come back. Because they have so many different thoughts that when we just stay calm and say, I'd love to hear more about that, it passes. What else do you do to make them feel supported?
Don't fly off the handle if they're blowing off steam at you.
That's perfect. Don't react. Just because they say something reactive to you, you don't need to react. If they yell at you, and in fact, the best thing, I love that point, because the best thing too I learned, my kids did not listen to a whole lot of what I said. They've never listened to a lecture I gave them. But they act just like me. the best thing we can do is model. If your son or daughter has anger management issues and you find yourself losing it, start with figuring out how to get to that calm place for yourself.
Sometimes that's harder.
Oh, for sure. And you know what I always tell parents? Walk away.
Oh.
And you might have a follower.
I was just going to
You
say,
might have a
I have a
follower.
follower that will not leave me even in the
Yeah.
bathroom. I'm
And
like,
we're going to
"For the
talk
love
about
of
that because
God."
there are followers.
Yeah.
I gotcha. But they follow you.
Oh,
So you say, I need a break, and they follow you. What are other ways we make our teens feel supported? Hugs.
Hugs.
Yeah. Spending time with them. Do your kids know how to de-stress and relax? No. Do they know how to have downtime?
Do they do it? Oh, that.
Do they know how to have downtime without electronics?
Yes. No. Yes.
And how do we encourage a bounce back mentality? How do we encourage helping our kids learn to bounce back? Helping them by not always focusing on the end result, but focusing on the process. Not focusing on, did you get an A, but focusing on, were you able to try something different? Were you able to ask for help? So going back to school this year looked different. The last couple of years, I think we can all agree, have looked different. When things look different, they can be uncomfortable. One thing I say a lot is my job as a therapist is to help your child, help you practice being comfortable, being uncomfortable. This year looked different. Many of your kids were out of the typical routine last year. Things were different. It's adjusting your expectations. Your kids may struggle with some of these changes. Your kids may struggle with doing things new. If you have a child that you know has a hard time with transition or change, you can expect that there might be some struggle. What are healthy levels of stress that your child, that we would expect that a teenager would go through? How many of you have more than one child at home? Okay. So like I said, I have 2 daughters a year apart. Totally different. My younger child is more like me. We naturally thrive on being busy and doing a lot of things. I started my day early. I have a lot of energy. It doesn't bother me to be here at night. I love it. I love being around people. My older daughter is a lot more like my husband. That's all I'm gonna say. They just are at a slower pace. They need breaks. They can't handle as much. They like lots of breaks. They like to go slower. They need more downtime. They're both very intelligent, but they're totally different. And so I had to adjust my expectations. So we have to be mindful of what our expectations of what success looks like for each of our kids. And it's going to look different for every child. Success isn't always going to mean that they do amazing every day. It might mean that they're here, so we have to set some small goals and look at what success is going to be like for them. Setting realistic expectations. Just because your teenager is struggling right now, I cannot stress this enough, is not a clear indicator of how things are going to look in a year or two. Some of my most successful grown-ups that I now still talk to that were struggling as kids back in the day, totally different story. I've got some kids that I worked with in high school that were very successful, struggling now. It's not about are you successful, are you a failure, it's how do you handle struggle. I work with a lot of gifted kids too, I work with a lot of college athletes. We have these conversations on a regular basis. We're going to talk a little bit about anxiety, but like I said, I think we have to be careful. I've noticed we all have a tendency to call everything anxiety lately, and I think we just have to be mindful because I think it replaces a lot of what can be going on for kids in terms of how they're feeling when we keep saying, are you anxious? You must be so anxious. You need an anxiety program. You're so anxious. For many of our kids, they may be feeling things like shame or sadness or anger, all these different emotions, and we have to be careful not to label everything under an umbrella. Everybody experiences stress and anxiety in different ways. For some of us, we have a lot of stress in our lives. How many of us can relate to that? We have a lot of stress. We work on managing the stress. Sometimes our stress boils over, can cause us to feel anxious. Anxious people do not usually get up in the morning when they're experiencing some anxiety and worry that everything is going to go well. What happens is when our body starts to become overwhelmed and we feel anxious or we feel heightened emotional state, we have thoughts. Those thoughts are just symptoms of what's going on for us. They're not necessarily reality. When people do become nervous or anxious, they think things like, it's never going to get better, I can't handle this is too much, and then they tend to avoid. People that do experience anxiety when they're in that place, when they are feeling anxious, and again, it's not always anxiety, so we have to be careful of that, but what happens is they start to have thoughts and they worry. So for many of our kids, and really everyone's teens in here have experienced anxiety at some point, we help them to understand that just because you have a thought does not mean it's reality. The problem is anxiety is contagious. So if you have a teenager that's dealing with anxiety, it might promote anxiety for you, or you might also be struggling with anxiety. It can be distressful and it can be uncomfortable. When I get overly stressed, I carry it in my upper back. So for me, I know my upper back is really tight, I'm overwhelmed. I work a lot with teenagers on setting realistic expectations, understanding that they're not supposed to be perfect, they're not supposed to do everything well. Everyone's different in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, but helping them understand. For instance, when I was in high school, I was terribly anxious of public speaking. Probably had the worst fear of it ever. I don't know what was wrong with the school I went to, but nobody asked me how I felt when I was in high school. Like, I was just scared and worked through it and avoided it. When we're anxious, and this was many years ago, when we're anxious, we try to avoid what makes us anxious. The number one thing people with anxiety do is they avoid whatever makes them anxious. So think about situations that might cause your teenager to be uncomfortable. And I'll tell you what teens tell me. They tell me the top ones are taking tests, making a mistake, not being good enough, being embarrassed in front of others, going into a crowded lunchroom and not knowing anyone. What are some other ones?
Making new friends.
Making new friends.
Dating. Dating.
Dating. Getting an answer wrong in class. Not being successful. Fear of failure. Fear of disappointing others. So we think about the situations that cause us to be uncomfortable, and we want to help our kids realize that they can be resilient and not avoid those situations. So we want them, when I have someone come to my office, we look at all the situations that cause them to be uncomfortable. We kind of decide which ones cause them the least discomfort, and then we practice doing situations that cause that anxiety. So again, I'm helping people work through being comfortable, being uncomfortable, recognizing that there are going to be physical symptoms of stress and anxiety. What are other underlying feelings, possibly sadness, grief, what other things are going on. Sometimes there's family stress that can be contributing for the student, things like that. We work on that, and then we behave our way into feeling better. We start to do things that might cause us to be uncomfortable until we start to feel better, but it takes time. You want to avoid giving your child with anxiety a lot of reassurance. You don't want to take an anxious person. One, you don't want to do a lot of talking when they're anxious. You can't talk somebody out of being stressed or emotional or anxious. So when your teen is anxious, stressed, mad, emotional, any heightened emotional. How many of you guys, your teens get pretty emotional? Okay. You want to recognize when they're very emotional, and you don't want to engage in a lot of conversation because they're in that heightened emotional state. They're not processing information. How many, when your kids get ramped up, you get ramped up? You want to avoid, if they're ramped up and you're ramped up, what's going to happen? Right, exactly. It does not. How many of you guys have ever gotten into a big power struggle or argument with your kids and it really helped? You walk away feeling like crap, right? You're like, I can't believe I just said that. We all say things that we don't mean. When they're emotional or you're emotional, you want to bring it down a little bit. You want to avoid getting into it with them, which I know can be challenging. But what happens is you also want to avoid the reassurance. You want to avoid saying things like, it's going to be okay, don't worry about it, I know you're going to be amazing. Reassurance does not help anxiety. In fact, it perpetuates the cycle. It can make it a lot worse. In fact, and again, it's natural to always want to say things like that, but just recognize it's not overly effective. We may say something like, I know this might be really difficult for you tomorrow, how can you manage? Does that make sense? I had and Ginger knows this, when I worked at the hospital, I started the school anxiety program at Alexian Brothers. I'm not there anymore, but when I was at the program and I was working there, one of the things I realized, I would get parents and they would come and they would bring their teenager to the school anxiety program. And I would go out to the car, typically I'd have to go out to the car because the teenagers would be refusing to come in. So I'd go out to the car, I would do the whole thing, long story short, I'd get them in the program, get the kid signed up for the program, get the parent, kind of separate them because the parent would be upset if the kid was upset, got the kid situated in the program, parent left. Well, after a couple hours, the kid started doing okay. But at 3 o'clock, the teenager would see the parent again. What do you think would happen? The teenager would start to fall apart a little bit, right? Because our teenagers tend to act different with us than they do with other adults. I got smart because I recognized I saw a pattern where the teenager would say to the parent, this was the worst day ever, I'm not going back there, how could you send me, this was horrible, this was awful. Because it takes 3 days to adjust to a program. So I got smart. So what I did is I called the parent, or I met with the parent right after the kid went in the door. And I said, this is what's going to happen because realistically it takes 3 days for your teenager to adjust to the program. And I want you to understand that it's going to be really difficult, but at 3 o'clock they're going to come and they're probably going to say it was the worst day ever and you're going to feel bad and you guys are going to talk each other into a tizzy on the way home because you're all going to be upset. I want you to stay calm and just say back to the child, sounds like you had a difficult day, what could you do tomorrow? Because you're going back and that's my expectation. It sounds silly, but when I was able to have those conversations with parents, they were always able to manage because it was about the parent's anxiety. The parent was struggling because they didn't know what to do with all of that. And so we had to kind of come up with a script of what to say. Distraction doesn't help when you're in an emotional state either. We learn to sit with it. So we teach our teenagers how to just sit with that discomfort. And it takes time. Like I'll teach a teenager a coping strategy. And I learned this too, another mistake I made when I was working in a high school. I would give these teenagers these amazing coping strategies. And they'd come back and they'd say, well, none of it works. I realized I didn't teach them how to do it. Because realistically, it's going to take a couple minutes. If you're using a coping strategy, whether it's breathing or anything like that, you got to almost set a timer and realize it takes 2 to 3 minutes to bring your physical symptoms down. What are situations that cause your teenagers to be uncomfortable? What would you say are situations that your teenagers struggle with? Socializing. Okay.
Feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities.
Overwhelmed by responsibilities. Change. Any homework? Getting assignments done? How many of your teenagers have had to deal with a teacher they didn't like? How many of your teenagers had a teacher that didn't like them? Yeah. I always tell kids, it's going to happen while you're in high school. Not everyone's going to like you. You're going to have people that don't necessarily like you. And I can call the school and request a different teacher, but eventually you're going to run into someone that doesn't think you're as amazing as we do. And how do you have that conversation? How do you deal with that? Because my goal as your parent is for you to start to learn to deal with difficult things. How do you typically respond when your teen is anxious or upset? When your kids are struggling, how do you guys typically respond?
Try to reassure them.
You reassure them?
Which sounds like that might not be the right thing to do.
I mean, it's what we have in the moment, and whatever we have in the moment is what we have. I just don't know that it really helps in the moment, because sometimes, and if you can think of a time that you were like really nervous or anxious in a situation, the only way to bring that down was to do what caused you to be anxious and kind of move forward. Kids that are struggling emotionally, and we're going to talk about this, they need more structure and consistency. But as parents, we tend to, a lot of times, feel sad or feel guilty or feel worry about our kids, so we lower the expectations and we want to bring in more comfort. But sometimes that's not always the answer. When our kids are struggling, they need the expectations to be consistent. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by expectations. I had a parent recently, and she was struggling. Her son wouldn't go to school. He was too overwhelmed. He was too anxious, he was behind in schoolwork, so he wasn't going to school and he had migraines. I work a lot with kids with physical and medical conditions too. And those kids, if you ever go to a pain management hospital or clinic, you don't get any electronics when you go. They focus on a lot of structure, a lot of consistent expectations, and they help you really work through the pain. When our kids are struggling, they need a little bit more consistency, which is hard. And we're going to give some examples, but really it goes against what we feel like doing, because we kind of sometimes as parents feel our way through situations because we love our kids so much, but it's about kind of what are some goals that you want to set for your kids. What kind of adult are you trying to raise? What do you want that kid to look like when they're 26 years old? What are some of the characteristics you want that adult to have, and how do you parent in a way to raise that young adult? The maintaining expectations, and it doesn't have to be intense expectations. I'm not talking about like my expectation is that you have all A's, or my expectation is that you do well at everything all the time, because every child's different. Some kids, school is just not, it doesn't come easy for them. When you think about expectations, think about kind of what are the expectations in your home. Are they that you go to school? Are they that you do some chores? Are they that you don't swear and scream at me? Are they that you go to work? Every family is going to be different. Think about what a couple expectations are that you have in your home, and how do you respond when the child doesn't meet the expectation? Whether they just don't meet them, whether they're anxious, whether they're sad, whether they have a migraine, how do you respond when they don't meet the expectations? So the one mom said, I'm not going to argue with you, I'm not going to tell you you have to go to school, but just understand on days you don't go to school, you're not going to have your laptop or your phone, your gaming device. What do you think the kid said? Well, the kid eventually did, but the kid at first said some pretty mean things I'm not going to repeat, and then said, that's not fair, you're punishing me for not feeling well. And I've had some kids even take it a step further than that. And the parent said, I'm not going to argue with you. These are our expectations. I'm not engaging with you. It took about, how many days does it take to start to see some change? 3 to 4. Just know it's going to get worse before it gets better, but again, only be consistent with what you can. If you know this is hard for you, start with something really small. I've had some parents just start with, I'm not going to yell for 3 or 4 days. I'm going to hone in on one thing. I'm just going to practice one thing for 3 or 4 days. That's all I can do right now. I've got a lot going on. I'm just going to practice for the next 3 or 4 days. I'm going to stay calm in situations. That's where I'm at. And they kind of said, okay, did this work? It's been 3 or 4 days. We have some kids that are struggling with different mental health issues, whether it's anxiety and stress, depression, and these are just some. I see a lot of kids with electronic addictions, video game addictions. They have a hard time getting off gaming devices. They have a hard time. Sometimes kids with ADHD and anxiety diagnoses can be more prone to addiction with electronics. You might see that they even have a harder time when you try to start to set limits. And this isn't a whole list. This is just some of what we're seeing. Eating disorders, whether it's eating restriction, binging, purging behaviors, and self-injury. And again, this is just some of the list, but these are some of the things that we've seen kids deal with. Did you guys have any questions? Every one of your teenagers has strengths. Every one of your teenagers has things that they do well, and every one of your teenagers has things that they struggle with. We want our kids to know you're supposed to have things that you do well and supposed to have things that you struggle with, and it's okay whatever that looks like. Everyone's different. What's something, do your teens understand that it's okay to have strengths and weaknesses? Because everyone does. There's areas that we do well and there's areas that we struggle. I always say let's embrace our weaknesses as much as our failures. I always tell parents, we joke about it at dinner. What's one thing that you did well and what's one thing you totally screwed up today? Or what's one thing that went well for you today and what's one thing that you had a hard time with? And let's talk about it and normalize that they're supposed to make mistakes. It's okay if they struggle in a class. It's okay if they don't do well on a test. Celebrate with them, kind of reinforce, well, how did you handle that? That had to be really hard. What do you think you can do? And get them thinking about different ways that they can handle that. Some kids might do, I had one mom tell me today, God, my one child just does so well in school, and my other child, God, I can barely get him to get to a class. They struggle with organization and schoolwork. Again, make sure that your child knows what those strengths are and celebrate their strengths. Don't always focus on what they're not doing well or their failures. That's going to be important to think outside of the box. And what would you say success looks like for your teenager? What would you guys consider success?
They're athletes.
They're athletes?
Happiness.
Happiness? Unfortunately, that's going to change. We try to figure out what happiness is, because I get that a lot, and I think happiness is really being able to experience all the different emotions and kind of find that contentment. But I think as parents that truly is, and I appreciate you saying that, because I think we all want our kids to be happy and healthy and not struggle. The reality is we want to teach our kids how to struggle well. You want your teenagers hopefully to leave high school and know how to struggle, because I can tell you, when my kids left high school, we don't have a lot of control over a lot of things once they leave our doors, and they are going to struggle and things are going to happen, and we want our kids to know how. And the things I always say when I started the program in Amita, my goal for the teenagers that came through the program was that they would leave and they would know how to ask for help, and most of them didn't when they came in. We practiced all the time asking for help, because a lot of our kids struggle problem solving. If there's a problem in front of you, do you have the confidence and do you know how to kind of figure it out? And can you manage feeling uncomfortable? Can you put yourself in situations, even though you're going to be uncomfortable, and be able to work through it? And that's how I measured success for the kids. I wasn't as worried about their grades at that time. I wasn't worried about, can you ask for help? Can you leave this program, solve a problem? And we would do exercises to promote physical feelings of discomfort, and then we would sit with them with their body all uncomfortable, and we would just practice sitting with that. You guys want to do that now?
Sure.
No, we're not going to do that. I'd probably get in trouble. You guys are like, at this point, I don't care. It sounds, and again, just something to think about. And that's when I say, if your kids are not where you think they should be, they're just where they're supposed to be. And we have to figure out kind of what skills do they need. And I'm big on, I look at, and Ginger knows this too, I look at kids as where they are intellectually, where they are emotionally. And I kind of work to bring up the emotional development so there's less of a discrepancy. I don't look at clients or kids as parents broken or they need to be fixed or something's wrong. Everyone's different, and we're all, what do we need to work on to kind of gain some more skills? This is my model that I go by, and we talk a lot about kind of that whole child engagement, is helping our kids understand their strengths, areas they need to work on. If they want to work on areas, and I have a couple college athletes who are working on this, if there's areas that you want to improve, I'll work with you on that. There may be areas that your kids are not motivated to improve on, and that's okay right now. That's just where they are. Are there areas that you want to improve? This second one is a big one. How do we, within our family, build connections? Because this can be challenging for a lot of our teenagers. Many of your teenagers, and you may have a teenager at home right now, and you might even be thinking sometimes, I don't like this kid that much. That's normal as a parent, right? I don't know how to connect to this kid. Like we don't have a whole lot in common. I mean, I remember there was one point where I found the only way I could have a conversation with my daughter when she was younger, probably about 7th grade. Anybody have a middle school girl? Yeah, it's not easy. I Snapchatted her because she would answer. And I would start to kind of try to figure out what her mode of communication was, because it wasn't mine, and we would start to try to bond on things she liked. I have a lot of kids that struggle with connection. They don't connect the way we do, and so we think that they don't want to be with us or they don't care, but they're struggling. You know, a lot of these kids are on electronics a lot. And a lot of teenagers are saying there's not enough adults around that aren't on their electronics. So be mindful of when you are with them, not answering your phone or being on your computer and multitasking, but really trying to be undivided. If you know there's patterns, if you're sitting there going, God, every time I come in the room, my child leaves, which is, it's a typical thing for some teens. Don't try harder, try different. Think about how you're responding. How are you responding? I had a girl today in my office that said, Mom, I don't feel like I can talk to you because every time I talk to you, you lecture me. No, I don't. And she went on and on and on and told her how the kid was wrong. Is that helpful? No. If your child's telling you, and maybe get feedback, how do you think, what could I do so we can connect more? Go on walks, try different ways of communication. But if you recognize there's a pattern, don't keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different result. Do something different, because then you might get a different result. The structures is hard, but we talk a lot about just having some expectations and trying to hold them consistently. So if you have a child, and everyone in here, I don't know what, different things your teens are struggling with, but a couple of expectations, we're gonna have these expectations, and if you choose to meet them, then, you can have the privilege. Whether you're struggling emotionally, whether you have a migraine, whether you aren't feeling well, that's fine. We want you to take care, and we want to teach you about self-care, but there is going to be some ways that we're going to respond. And a lot of parents, honestly, that's where a lot of parents with me get hung up. I don't feel comfortable doing that. That's not nice. When we talk about it, it's not about punishment as much as it is creating a sense of consistency, and most kids feel safe in that. They don't do well when it changes a lot. And again, we talked about this, every one of your teens is going to be different. And I added these two because every teen is going to be different in terms of their cognitive and emotional, but also how their language, how they process information, how they explain themselves. You might have a child that's really great and articulate and talks a lot, and you might have a child that says 1 or 2 words. Physical development. You might have a child that's 15 that looks 19, and you might have a child that, that is a lot younger than their chronological age. Every teen is different. So you have to kind of figure out, where am I setting expectations that are realistic? Just because your child's approaching 18, it doesn't mean that they're ready to launch. That number, parents get hung up on that number. They're almost 18 and they're not ready to live on their own. Where are they emotionally? You're not, it just is, kids are different today. It takes a while. We're working on skill development, it's okay. They don't need to go from 18 to full adults. It's gonna look different. If your child goes to a trade school, if your child goes to a 2-year school, if your child goes to a 4-year school, whatever that path is, as long as that's the right fit for them, that's a great path. Don't try to kind of get them into something that's not the right fit. That's like kids, I'll get a call from kids that are overwhelmed with their classes, and I see their schedule, and it's too much. It's not a good fit for them. We want kids to have a healthy balance. We talked about the emotions a little bit, just allowing our teenagers to experience emotions, and we watched, I know a couple years ago, there was a TED Talk, and we talked about it. It was by a 21-year-old named Scout, and she said, the hardest thing about growing up is adults have a hard time with us having any kind of emotions. That they want us to be happy, and we don't know how to be happy because it's not realistic. Why do adults need us to be happy and successful all the time? And that really got me thinking, like, our kids are getting this message that they're supposed to be happy and successful all the time. And they're feeling like they're failing us because they're not able to do that. So I think changing the message a little bit, discussing challenges and being open about modeling for them about things that are difficult for you. Challenges you're having and how you deal with that. What are supports they can use, helping your teens to understand that. I think we're doing a really good job of this. I think we're doing a good job. There's mental health services. There's lots of different ways we can have conversations with our kids. Really listening. I love how you said listening earlier. I know with my 23-year-old, she debates us all the time. And she's always right. I don't know if you find that, but any debate, she is right, and we just kind of hunker down and know she knows way more than we do, and so we just have to listen. But she loves telling us about all this knowledge she has, and we don't argue with her. Sometimes we get into like fun debates, but this is such a great time to have conversations with your teens and just listen. And even if your mind, you're like, this is ridiculous, like they don't know half of what they're talking about, right? You have to just be like, that sounds really Tell me more about that in your 2 days of being in the workforce. How did you learn all that? You know, that's great. But we're listening and we're going with that. Something I'm grateful for and something that was difficult for me today, or, you know, I don't typically ask teenagers, how are you, in terms of like when they come in the office, because I typically get fine. For some of you guys, you might get something different. I might ask kind of, how are you, but then I also ask, you know, what's something that went well today and something that you totally screwed up, or what's something that went well today and something that was difficult for you, and I always get an answer to that. And we talk about that. And we know that teenagers are going to be different with parents than they are with other people, and I see that in the office too. If you have a teenager that's really disrespectful to you, you know, if you have a teenager that's slamming doors, swearing at you, throwing things at you, you know, I get that a lot. You want to just be mindful of kind of changing that pattern. You don't want to continue to have that go on, because one, you know, we want to co-regulate with our teens. We want to teach them how to regulate. So, and I talk a lot with adults on this topic. We need to stay calm ourselves, remove yourself, and if you have a kid that's following you, then when you guys are calm, we go back to this conversation of, okay, you know what, and I always have the conversation when we're calm. I see that we're in a pattern that you keep following me, and if that continues, I'm going to give you a warning, but this is what's going to happen. I had one mom, and it's got to be what works for you. She said, you know, you're not going to have your phone for 24 hours. You can continue to follow me, but when you're done following me, that 24 hours is going to start. I mean, I've had parents do all different things. You got to do what works for you, but you want to nip that in the bud, but you can't nip that in the bud until you make sure that you're not displaying the same behavior. Because you can't, it doesn't work to say don't do that when you're doing it as the adult. We do, I mean, it happens, but it doesn't, it's not helpful. You know, just building on strengths. Do you guys have any questions?
How do you deal with someone who's strictly black and white? There's no gray.
A lot of our kids are very black and white. It's all or nothing. And one of the things we did when we were in the school anxiety program too is we even talked about kind of different levels, because I know a lot of the kids can be very 0 to 10, it's all or nothing. And sometimes as parents we can too. I mean, I can't tell you how many parents will call me and the teen will have been doing pretty good. One thing happens and the parent will call me and say, we're back to square one, nothing's working, therapy's not working, we're doing something different. I'm like, your kid had a bad day. You know, that's the thing. There's no such thing as a good or bad day. Every day is a day where a lot happens. And I have this exercise that I'll do with kids sometimes where they'll come in and say, today was a bad day. And I'll be honest, a lot of times when the teen says it was a bad day, the parent's upset because it was a bad day, everybody's upset it was a bad day, when really one thing happened during the day that was challenging. So we'll write it out on a piece of paper, what's something that happened during each period of the day, and they'll see it on the paper and they'll say, okay, it was just a day where a lot happened and I really struggled at lunch. You know, I think it's just about helping our kids not be so reactive, because so often we react to one thing and again our thoughts start spiraling. You know, our thoughts start spiraling and then pretty soon we've kind of got this whole predictor going of I can't manage it. And a lot of times things can be psychological. We can psych ourselves out. We can kind of develop this belief, I can't do it, I'm terrible and awful. I talked to a young woman that just got married, and she was, she's focused on, she doesn't like how she looks in the pictures. My arms look heavy, I don't like how I look in the pictures. These pictures are awful, nobody can see them. It was the wedding, I shouldn't have got married, it was terrible and awful. And she had herself down in this whole spiral. When a week ago, she had talked about how much she loved the wedding, how it was so great. We can easily spiral. That's why as parents, one of the things that I work a lot with parents on practicing is when we stay calm, they come down. When we rise up, they rise up. And sometimes just waiting till they're done. You know, I've had kids in front of me and they've been spiraling and they're crying hysterically, and I don't respond. I just say, you know what, looks like you need a couple minutes, you're really upset. You know, take a couple minutes, work on your breathing, and let's talk when you're done. You're so mean, you don't understand. What's it gonna help for me to be talking while you're emotional? You know, I cue them to bring it down. I mean, I've had parents tell me kids are screaming and yelling and they're having panic, Jackie, they're anxious. They're not anxious, they're pissed off. You just took their video games away and now they're pissed. You know, again, and that's what I said in the beginning, we're discounting their feelings if we're just saying it's all anxiety, because it's not, there's a lot of different things going on. Sometimes people truly are anxious, but sometimes there's other emotions. And I think anxious people, it doesn't cause them to throw chairs. So if your child's throwing a chair at you, you can't just say, well, they were anxious, so they threw the chair. I mean, you can't just excuse the behavior. You can have emotions, but we're still responsible for what we do. If we need to work on that, we can work on it, but we don't want to excuse away all these behaviors. You know, they couldn't do this because of that. Because what happens is then their confidence goes down, and they develop this belief they can't handle it. We're going to talk about some coping strategies too. I think we're okay. Are you guys okay without it?
Yeah.
That's fine. You sure? Because I can start over. Do you guys want to do that? I know some of you guys said, this goes to 10, right? And I was like, yeah.
So, I'm sorry, I don't want to forget my train of thought here. We've talked a lot about kids that are emotional and reactive, and but there's a type of kid also that's the opposite, and shuts down, and doesn't offer how they're feeling.
Yeah.
And the challenge is, how do I get information without antagonizing? You know, you want to help, you want to be there, you want to encourage them to share, but they'd rather just be alone in their room and don't want to talk.
Well, okay, so this is a good question. So there's kids that too aren't able, and I had this conversation today, sometimes there's kids that don't know what they're feeling. Like they struggle with emotion. And there's adults too. Some of us, I mean, some of you might be more emotional people, and you know, you cry and you become emotional, and you might know someone, or you might be someone that really just doesn't connect a lot to emotions, you know, and typically we laugh. That's more kind of the rational type mind. The kids that stay in the room and don't come out, a lot of times as parents we talk about, you know, kind of working on ways to get them out of the room, meaning that sometimes we'll even, if the gaming devices and everything are there, and this isn't, obviously I don't know your situation, but even some parents will even have to remove the gaming devices out of the room sometimes. You know, I had one girl, she was in 7th grade, she got really depressed, and the parent brought her to me, and we talked about, you know, she was in her room isolating, and she was explosive, and the mom said, you know, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing. If we, you know, we need to see more interaction. We're not going to allow you to keep in your room. And she did some different things. Sometimes you don't want to push it, you don't want to kind of over talk to them, but you don't want to allow them in their room all the time either, because they could become further isolative and get more depressed. Some kids just aren't that emotional, and so some kids aren't going to necessarily sit around and tell you how they feel, and you want to be realistic in what to expect, but you can start to build those connections.
Right, that's the balance. Is
Right.
If they've never been someone who's been overly sharing, then this side of me is like, okay, he's a little more, introverted, or there's something going on that he doesn't feel comfortable talking about. I don't know the difference because he's not saying anything.
Look at how they're functioning overall. Like if you're concerned and he's not functioning well and he's not, you know, we want these kids to have some connection. We don't want them totally in their room. But we want them connected, but he doesn't have to be emotional. Not everyone's emotional and wants to talk about their emotions.
Right.
A lot of times I start with kids about just talking about things that they like, just having basic conversation and basic dialogue, and just trying to spend some time. I'm interested, whether it's I'm interested in your game, you know, I want to kind of hear more about it, but at the same time, you know, we're not going to be in our room for hours on end isolating. You know, we need to kind of have you come out. Most kids do better with some interaction with adults. They don't do good isolating so much. Now, there's a theory that if you have all your friends on the Xbox system all over the world, you know, that's their friends, but even those kids, they need to kind of come out. And I have a couple of those kids right now. And the parents have said, you have to meet these expectations, and this is when and they do a lot. I don't want to get into this tonight, but I have a lot of teenagers that are, and they're making money doing,
Gaming
videos.
YouTube.
Yeah, they're gaming videos. The new thing, all the teens are doing where they're getting videotaped, and they're getting money. Blanking on the name of it. It's you're gonna go home tonight. Your kids are all gonna have like millions of dollars in them. I'm blanking on the name. What's it called, you guys?
Gaming?
No.
No,
I know what she's. Fortnite.
people give you money when you're playing video games and they're watching you play video games. No.
No. I know what you're talking
There's
about.
this is the
I'll
new
let
thing,
you
and
know.
it's whoever can be more popular. People get money, and I have one girl, she's getting quite a bit of money. I mean, you get money, and people give you money, and it just goes.
Is it Twitch?
Like, how much money?
You can get a lot. The scary thing is
You can get some good money.
Yeah.
But there's
Again,
also,
you can get some good money.
Depending on how many people watch you.
Yeah.
Then
You can get some
you
good
can
money.
just do nothing pretty much, even though watch.
Yeah. So
there's also,
Yeah, I don't.
you know, there's all,
I'm good at it.
I mean, the other day I was talking with my friend, and she said when she was younger, you know, her parents pretty much forced her outside, forced her to be out, you know, not in her room. She said they just did. I was never allowed to stay in my room.
Yeah.
I always had to do this. And obviously she grew up well, you know, but I mean, I always wonder, you're also allowed to have that privacy. I just think kids, I want to honor that. If they want to have their privacy,
Right.
I don't think there's anything wrong
you want to
with
look at
that.
how they're functioning. How are they functioning overall? If you're concerned, you know, and if you're concerned your teen's struggling, they're not showering, they're not getting assignments done, they're not getting to school, if they're not, you know, it goes back to kind of what are the expectations? Are they in a healthy place? Definitely being in your room. You know, you don't want your teen up till 2 a.m, can't get up for school. You don't want the kid like only up there. You know, kids need connections. I mean, and I can tell you some of the clients I've worked with, some of the teens that have struggled the most connecting with me, I've kind of been the first to say, I don't think I'm the right fit for this therapist. Come to find, this is a kid that just has a hard time connecting, and they actually feel like they're connecting to me. Sometimes we like take for granted because they're not connecting in the way we think they should, that they're not. You know, and just different coping strategies. Before we leave, because I know we have to end, I want to just share a couple of the coping strategies that we work a lot with kids on and we work a lot with parents on. And you know, one of them is, and I have something that I do, and I do this pretty regularly, is whenever I'm in a stressful situation or I'm overwhelmed or I'm feeling very emotional about something, I literally will sit down and just write down all the facts about the situation. And I help kids do this too, and then we separate out what's the reality, what are the facts, versus how am I feeling about the facts. You know, when I have a kid that says to me, I'm never going to be successful, I feel like I'm just going to be a failure, I'm never going to amount to anything, and I hear this a lot. And I'm like, you're only 7. You know? And I hear this from even the young kids. We talk about like, what's the reality? And we start to look at what the reality is. The other thing I do a lot is, it's, you know, behave your way in the next 15 minutes. Visualize, if you're feeling really frustrated and you know your kid's about to really upset you or your significant other, visualize how you want the next 10 to 15 minutes to go, and kind of in your mind, you behave your way into that ending. Kind of visualize it and see it and just know, I just have to, if anything, I just know this kid's gonna say something that's gonna piss me off, so I'm just gonna kind of disconnect for a minute. They can keep going, and I know that if I lose my cool, I've lost. I need a break. And even if you have to go outside or just take a break for 5 minutes, nothing, you can come back to any of it. There's nothing that you can't come back to. You want to come back to the conversation when it's calm. You know, I have a lot of kids that are in the room and the parents are having a hard time getting them out of the room. Sometimes you just have to use logical parenting. You know, if I'm concerned, if I can't get you to come out of your room, then you're showing me that you can't manage these electronics and they're going to have to be shut down. I'm not going to fight with you, and I'm not going to get you up and beg you to get up in the morning. You know, sometimes it's about being realistic with them, but you can only have the conversation when they're calm. And you can, you know, I have a lot of parents, and I don't know, obviously, clearly I'm not savvy, but a lot of parents have it on their phone. A lot of parents can shut down the games.
Yes, and they're also
Right.
kids that are hackers
Right.
into your systems, and they screw up your Wi-Fi. So I've had that. I mean, we've taken everything, and
Yeah.
so they're smart kids. I mean,
Yeah.
my son is obviously
Yeah.
very smart to get into our Wi-Fi. I mean, I'm not happy about it, I'm pretty pissed off, but, you know, how do you do that then?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and this is where I know Ginger and Nate are going to come up and talk for a little bit. I think they got about a 45-minute presentation for you guys now. But seek help. You know, the one thing is there's tons of help out there today. You guys have an amazing staff here, clearly that are committed to this. You guys have a million different mental health agencies within a throw. You could throw a rock. I mean, there's all kinds of counseling and different services. I mean, just ask for help. And it's okay to say to your kid, you know, I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing. We're going to be doing something different. You know, and they're not necessarily gonna be happy about it, they might get pretty upset, but just understand that, you know, that's okay. You can tolerate as a parent your child being upset with you. You know, you can tolerate if you recognize you're a parent and you're like, gosh, I'm having a really hard time with this, seek someone to talk to and do some parenting work. You know, I have some resources up here, I've got resources back there, you got a million, you know, a bunch of resources, the school's got tons, so seek help if you need it, but I think also be realistic that your kid isn't gonna be happy and okay all the time. You know, you wanna be realistic that it's okay to allow your child to struggle a little bit. If your kid's struggling, you don't need to necessarily be frantic that, oh my gosh, they're not gonna be okay because they're not doing well in a couple of classes. You know, you wanna allow them that chance to struggle a little bit.
My daughter goes by the mantra from Amita, it's okay not to be okay.
That's a good mantra.
And she lives by it, and all of us have bracelets, well, we don't have them now because they all broke, but we used to have bracelets and we wore them for over a year.
Yeah, was that a long time ago?
No, it's just recent,
Oh,
maybe last year or the year before COVID, yeah.
That's good, yeah.
I wish they had them here, actually, but I guess somebody makes them and they're in the city, so you can't get them. But yeah, that's a kind of a big mantra now for mental health. It's
Yeah.
okay not to be
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah,
and our family believes in that,
I
and
think
we're
that's
trying.
good. That's a good
to-
mantra.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys, and if you need anything, let me know. If you need anything, really let Ginger know. She's available all of the time for you guys. I will give you her cell phone.
Thank you.